Of course the land was already being repossessed. Of course it was. Why on earth would I have expected anything else? Given everything I thought I knew, and clearly didn't. I spent 36 years of my working life making sure vulnerable families in the north of England had secure housing, roofs that couldn't be pulled out from under them by landlords or councils or bad luck. And then I retired, flew to a province in Isan I couldn't have found on a map 5 years earlier, and handed over £310,000 for a piece of family land that a court had already begun the process of taking away. You couldn't write it. Actually, someone clearly did write it, and I was simply the man cast to star in it, the last one in the building to work out he was reading from a script. I was a social housing development manager for a large housing authority in the north of England, a job I did for the better part of 36 years, starting as a junior officer straight out of a polytechnic degree, and finishing, at 69, having overseen the delivery of several thousand housing units across 3 different local authorities. I want to be honest that I loved that job in a way that probably wasn't entirely healthy, in the sense that I built almost my entire identity around the idea that putting a family into secure, permanent housing was one of the few unambiguously good things a person could do with their working life. I attended more site openings than I can count, shook hands with more grateful tenants than most men shake hands with in a lifetime, and retired with a decent pension, a modest but comfortable inheritance from my parents when they passed within a year of each other, and a total liquid figure, once everything was combined, of £310,000. I want to say something about the specific culture of that job, because I think it explains a great deal about what happened afterward. A housing authority development, at least the kind I spent my career overseeing, is layered with checks that exist entirely independently of anyone's individual trustworthiness. Surveys before purchase, legal searches before contract, planning consent, building regulation inspection, tenancy law, a whole architecture of institutional skepticism built by people who had never met the specific family moving into a specific unit and didn't need to, because the system itself did the trusting on everyone's behalf. I spent 36 years operating inside that architecture without ever once having to personally verify, from scratch, whether a piece of land or a set of documents was what it claimed to be. Other processes did that. I simply approved, signed, and felt, each time, the specific satisfaction of a good outcome delivered, without ever building the muscle of doing the underlying verification myself. Retirement. For a man who had spent 36 years believing housing was a form of moral good, left an obvious kind of hole, and I filled it the way I suspect quite a lot of men in my position fill it, by looking for somewhere to keep doing the thing that had given my life meaning, just without the salary attached. I'd traveled to Thailand twice before, both times to Bangkok on ordinary package holidays with my late wife, and after she passed I found myself, somewhat to my own surprise, drawn back to the country, this time venturing further afield into Isan, the northeastern region, on the recommendation of a colleague from my final years at the housing authority who'd retired there himself a few years earlier. I liked the pace of it immediately. I liked that it felt like real life rather than a resort. Rice fields and modest towns, and an economy built on agriculture and family land rather than tourism. I met Nariman through that same retired colleague, at a gathering he'd organized for a handful of expatriates living around Roi Et province. And I want to be honest that what drew me to her initially wasn't romance in the conventional sense. Or not only that, she worked, at the time, as a clerk in the local government land records office. And she talked, that first evening, with what struck me as genuine feeling about families in the province losing land they'd farmed for generations, about the slow bureaucratic grind of debt and informal lending that ate away at rural landholding across Isan, the way it had eaten away, in a different form, at housing security in the towns I'd spent my career serving. I remember thinking, quite specifically, that I had finally found someone in this new country who understood the exact thing that had animated my entire working life, that land and housing weren't just assets. They were the difference between a family having a future and a family having nothing. I saw her regularly over the following 2 months, mostly dinners in the district town and a handful of day trips further into the province. And I want to say plainly that during that period, She asked me for nothing at all beyond company and conversation, a fact I would later turn over more times than almost any other detail in this account, because at the time I read it as evidence of her decency and have since had to sit with the far colder possibility that it was simply patience of a different kind, the specific patience of someone who understood that a request made too early loses its credibility. Of course, that's precisely the framing that should have worried me rather than moved me. And I say that now with the specific bitterness of a man who spent an entire career being paid to notice exactly this kind of vulnerability in other people's lives, and somehow failed to notice it in his own. We saw each other over the following months, and she introduced me, in due course, to her parents, an older farming couple who lived on a modest plot of family land outside a district town, whose name I won't bother giving you, because it will mean nothing to you, and meant, to me, everything. The land had been in her family for 3 generations, she told me, rice paddy mostly, with a small wooden house and an orchard of mango trees her grandfather had planted. I remember standing at the edge of that land the first time I visited, watching her father walk the boundary with the particular slow pride of a man showing off something his own father had built, and feeling, quite genuinely, moved. Her mother served us a meal that first visit, and I remember, with a specificity that has stayed with me far longer than it probably deserves, the taste of the som tam she made, sharper and more sour than anything I'd been served in Bangkok on my earlier holidays. And I remember thinking, quite genuinely, that this was the real version of the country I'd spent 2 package holidays, only glimpsing from the outside. Her father spoke almost no English, and communicated mostly through Nariman's translation, and through the simple, direct hospitality of a man showing a guest his land. And I remember feeling, that afternoon, a kind of settled certainty that I understood exactly what kind of family I was dealing with. A certainty I now recognize as having been built on precisely nothing beyond a good meal and an afternoon of goodwill. I learned over the following weeks the shape of the family's difficulty, and I want to describe it honestly because I think the honesty of how it was presented to me matters more than the eventual reveal. Her parents had accumulated debts over roughly 7 years, informal loans taken against the land through local moneylenders rather than a bank. The kind of arrangement I understood, even then, was common across rural Isan and was rarely straightforward to unwind once it had built up. Nariman described the mounting interest with what felt like real distress, the risk that the family could eventually lose the land entirely if the debts weren't cleared. And she asked me, eventually, tentatively, almost apologetically, whether I might consider purchasing the land outright, at a fair price, which would clear her parents' debts entirely and let the family remain on it as tenants of sorts, farming it as they always had, while I held the formal title as an investment. She framed it, and I want to be precise about this phrasing because I've turned it over more times than any other single sentence in this entire account, as an opportunity to do exactly the kind of good I'd spent my career doing, except this time with my own money and my own hands, securing a family's future the way I'd once secured hundreds of strangers' futures through council paperwork. I want to be honest about how completely that framing worked on me, because I think admitting the mechanism is more useful to anyone listening than simply describing the outcome. I had spent 36 years believing, without ever fully examining the belief, that investing in land and housing for families was inherently a noble act, a belief that had served me perfectly well inside a regulated public housing system, with legal protections, inspections, and due diligence built into every transaction by default. What I failed to translate, standing on that Isan rice paddy feeling the particular warm satisfaction of a man about to do good with his money, was that the nobility I associated with the act had never actually come from the land or the housing itself. It had come from the system around it, the surveys, the legal checks, the institutional scrutiny that made a housing authority transaction safe regardless of anyone's individual character. I imported the feeling of moral righteousness wholesale into a transaction that had none of the structure that had actually earned that feeling in my previous life. And I did it because the feeling itself was so familiar, so comfortable, that questioning it felt almost like questioning my own life's work. The purchase price, once negotiated, came to £310,000, converted at the time to just over 13 million baht, which I transferred in stages over about 6 weeks, as the various informal debts were identified and settled. I engaged a local solicitor recommended by Nariman herself to handle the paperwork, a decision I now recognize, with the specific bitterness of hindsight, as roughly equivalent to asking the fox to review the henhouse security plan. I remember signing the final transfer documents in a small provincial land office, Nariman's parents present, her father shaking my hand with what I took, at the time, for profound gratitude. And I remember feeling, walking out of that office, more satisfied with a financial transaction than I had felt since the day I'd signed off on my 400th completed housing unit at the authority, decades earlier. Of course I felt that satisfaction. Of course I did. I'd spent a career being trained to feel exactly that satisfaction, at exactly that kind of moment. And nobody had ever taught me to ask, in this specific unregulated context, whether the moment actually meant what I assumed it meant. I want to be direct about the 18 months that followed, because very little of it, on the surface, gave me any reason for alarm, which I think is precisely the point worth making to anyone else considering something similar. Nariman's parents continued farming the land exactly as they always had. I visited every few months, walked the boundary with her father the way I had that first visit, watched the mango trees produce their fruit, and felt, each time, a continued quiet pride in what I'd done. I want to flag, because I think it matters, that nobody asked me for further money during that period. There was no secondary drain, no emergency loan, no gold shop debt, none of the escalating financial demands that I understand define a great many stories like this one. The land simply sat there, apparently secure, apparently mine, generating nothing but the specific, self-congratulatory satisfaction of a man who believed he'd done something genuinely good. It was, in the end, an entirely unrelated piece of business that unraveled everything, and I think the ordinariness of it is worth describing precisely. I had decided, roughly 2 years after the purchase, to formalize a small piece of estate planning back in the UK, updating my will to include the Thai land as a named asset for my 2 adult children, and my English solicitor, a careful and unglamorous man named Ian who had handled my family's affairs for over a decade, asked, as a matter of routine due diligence, whether I had an independently verified, up-to-date title deed search for the property, rather than simply the transfer documents from the original purchase. I remember finding the question faintly bureaucratic and unnecessary at the time. Of course I had a title deed. I'd signed for it myself in that provincial land office. But Ian was insistent in the quiet, immovable way that good solicitors are, and I arranged, more to satisfy his paperwork than out of any genuine concern, for an independent land search to be conducted through a Bangkok law firm with no connection whatsoever to Nariman or her family. I remember the specific phone call with Ian where he pressed the point, because I've replayed it more than once since. I told him I didn't see the need, that I'd trusted the solicitor who'd handled the original purchase, and he asked me, mildly, whether that original solicitor had been my own independent choice, or a recommendation from the seller's side. I had to admit, with a slight and at the time unbothered shrug he couldn't see down the phone line, that it had been the latter. He didn't lecture me. He simply said that in 30 years of conveyancing work he'd never once regretted an independent search, and that he had, on more than one occasion, deeply regretted skipping one, and left it at that, which I now understand was Ian's particular way of being far more alarmed than his tone let on. The search came back within 3 weeks, and I want to describe reading that report honestly, because I think it's the most instructive part of this entire account. The document was dense, formal, entirely unglamorous, the kind of paperwork that gives no warning of the specific way it's about to detonate your understanding of the last 2 years of your life. Buried in the 3rd page, in language so administratively flat it almost disguised its own significance, was a note that the title in question had been subject to an active court foreclosure proceeding, initiated by a formal creditor rather than any of the informal lenders Nariman had described to me, filed roughly 3 months before my purchase had gone through. The proceeding, according to the report, had never been withdrawn. It had simply continued, in parallel, against the previous registration, while I had spent 2 years walking that land believing I owned it cleanly. I read that third page 4 times before the significance of it fully landed, and I remember, absurdly, that I was eating a slice of toast at the time, and that I set it down, half-eaten, on the side plate and never finished it. And that plate sat on my kitchen counter for the better part of 2 days before I finally cleared it away, because clearing it away felt, for reasons I couldn't entirely articulate, like admitting the conversation with the document was actually over. I sat with that document for the better part of an evening before I fully understood what I was reading, and I want to be honest that my first reaction wasn't panic. It was something closer to the specific, cold amusement of watching a familiar pattern reveal itself in a place I'd never expected to find it. Of course, the debts weren't simply informal moneylenders. Of course, the family had been facing something considerably more formal and considerably more dangerous than the sympathetic story I'd been told. And of course, my purchase price had gone, in practice, toward clearing exactly the kind of obligation that would otherwise have seen the land seized outright. While I inherited a title that now existed in a legal fog nobody had bothered to mention to me, because mentioning it would have meant admitting I wasn't rescuing anyone. I was paying off a debt on their behalf, while the actual legal jeopardy attached to the land, quietly transferred onto paperwork with my name on it. I confronted Naruman within the week, meeting her at a coffee shop in the district town, rather than at the family home, because some instinct I couldn't fully name told me I didn't want to have this conversation standing on the land itself. I laid the search results in front of her and asked, directly, whether she had known about the foreclosure proceeding when she'd first approached me about the purchase. She didn't deny it outright, which I suppose, in the flattest possible sense, I should credit her for. What she offered instead was that her role at the Land Records Office meant she saw a great many families in exactly this position, that the formal foreclosure and the informal debts were, in her account, simply 2 descriptions of the same underlying crisis, and that my purchase had genuinely saved the land for her family, regardless of which specific legal instrument had been threatening it. "You still helped us," she said, more than once, as though the outcome for her family retroactively resolved the question of what she'd actually told me before I handed over £310,000. I remember asking her, with what I can only describe now as exhausted, cynical curiosity rather than genuine hope of a satisfying answer, whether her job had shown her the foreclosure schedule before or after she'd first started seeing me. And she looked at me for a long moment before saying only that her work meant she saw these records constantly, which was, I noted even then, a very carefully worded non-answer delivered with the practiced calm of someone who had perhaps anticipated this exact question long before I ever asked it. I asked her whether the family's informal debts, the ones she'd originally described to me with such visible distress, had even been the real obligation at stake, or whether that framing had simply been easier for me to understand and easier for her to present than a formal court proceeding with a paper trail I might have thought to check. She didn't answer that one at all. She simply looked past me, out the window of the coffee shop, in a way that told me, more clearly than any sentence could have, that the conversation had reached the limit of what she intended to give me. I asked her, at one point, the plainer question underneath all of it, whether she had approached me at all, that first evening at the expatriate gathering, already aware of the foreclosure schedule, already understanding that a Western retiree with a housing background and an inheritance to spend might be persuaded to see a rescue where there was, in fact, a liability transfer dressed up as one. She didn't answer that question directly, and I have come to understand in the months since that the absence of an answer was itself the answer, delivered in the specific quiet of someone who has decided that saying nothing is less damaging than saying the truth out loud. I engaged a Thai lawyer within days, a sharp, unsentimental woman working out of Khon Kaen who specialized in rural land disputes, and she explained to me, with the patience of someone who has clearly delivered this exact explanation to other foreign buyers before me, that my legal position was considerably weaker than I'd hoped. The foreclosure proceeding predated my purchase, which meant, in practical terms, that my title had been acquired against an asset already subject to a superior legal claim, regardless of whether I'd known that at the time of purchase. She told me she had handled, in her career, at least a handful of cases with a broadly similar shape: foreign buyers, family land, a sale structured to clear an existing obligation while quietly leaving the buyer holding the resulting legal exposure, and that the pattern, whatever the specific circumstances, tended to end the same way regardless of how sympathetic the selling family's original hardship had genuinely been. She told me, plainly, that recovering the full purchase price from Naruman or her family was unlikely to succeed through the courts within any reasonable time frame, and that my more realistic options were either to attempt to settle the underlying foreclosure debt myself, a second, entirely separate sum on top of what I'd already paid, in order to actually secure clean title, or to accept the loss and walk away from the land entirely, letting the foreclosure proceed against whatever registration currently existed. I asked her, at one point, whether there was any meaningful argument that the sale itself had been fraudulent, given what I now understood about the timing, and she told me, carefully, that fraud was a difficult standard to meet in practice, that proving Naruman had known and deliberately concealed the foreclosure at the exact moment of the transaction, rather than simply failing to volunteer information she wasn't strictly obligated to disclose, would require evidence I did not currently possess, and might never be able to obtain. I sat in that lawyer's office in Khon Kaen doing the arithmetic I'd spent 36 years doing for other people's housing budgets, and never once expected to be doing for my own catastrophe. £310,000 already spent. A further sum, which her estimate put at somewhere between £40,000 and £60,000 depending on how the original creditor's claim was ultimately calculated, required simply to make the situation legally clean rather than legally toxic. I remember asking her, with what I can only describe as bitter, exhausted curiosity rather than genuine hope, whether there was any version of this where I came out whole, and she told me, without any unkindness, that in her experience there rarely was, once a title had already been compromised before a foreign buyer's name ever touched the paperwork. I did not pay the additional sum. I want to be honest that this wasn't principled defiance so much as a simple recognition that throwing further money at a hole that had already swallowed £310,000 was not, whatever my housing career had once taught me about persistence, the same thing as rescuing anyone. I let the land go, effectively, watching from a distance as the original foreclosure proceeding continued its slow bureaucratic course, ending, as these things generally do in rural Isan, not in some dramatic courtroom reckoning, but in a quiet administrative reassignment of the title to the original creditor. The specific fate of the family, and Naruman herself afterward being something I made a deliberate decision not to track, because tracking it felt, by that point, like picking at a wound that had no further useful information to offer me. I want to describe the specific flavor of the months that followed, because I think bitterness, done honestly, is more useful to anyone listening than false equanimity would be. I was angry, certainly, but the anger that actually stuck, the anger that outlasted the initial weeks, wasn't really directed at Naruman, or not only at her. It was directed at the version of myself who had spent 36 years being paid handsomely to distinguish between a legitimate housing transaction and a compromised one, who had built an entire professional identity on precisely that discernment, and who had then walked into a land purchase in a foreign jurisdiction and performed none of the due diligence I would have fired a junior officer for skipping. Of course I hadn't independently verified the title before purchase. Of course I'd trusted a solicitor recommended by the very family selling me the land. Of course I'd mistaken the warm feeling of moral satisfaction for actual evidence of a sound transaction, because that warm feeling had never once, in 36 years of institutional housing work, been wrong before. And nothing in my experience had ever taught me that the feeling itself could be manufactured independently of the safeguards that used to justify it. I flew back to England within 4 months of the discovery. Not in some dramatic single departure, but in the more mundane sense of simply deciding, gradually, that there was nothing left in Isan worth staying for. My children, both grown, both settled with families of their own, took the news with a kind of careful gentleness that I found, if I'm honest, harder to sit with than anger would have been. My daughter, in particular, asked me once, not unkindly, whether I'd ever have approved a housing authority purchase with this little independent verification, and I didn't have an answer for her beyond the truth, which was that I hadn't, not once, in 36 years, and that some part of me had apparently needed my own retirement to prove the point I'd spent an entire career demonstrating for other people's money rather than my own. I am 69 now, technically 70 within a matter of weeks of writing this, living in a smaller house than I'd planned to retire into, in the same northern town where I built most of my career, drawing down a pension that now has to stretch considerably further than I'd budgeted for. Given that just over a third of my entire liquid retirement fund is gone, converted permanently into a rice paddy and a stand of mango trees I will very likely never see again, and that some other family or some creditor's institution now farms or holds instead. I still see Ian occasionally, my solicitor, and there is a particular dry irony neither of us has ever needed to say out loud, that the one piece of caution he insisted on, the single independent search he refused to let me skip, was simultaneously the thing that ended the fantasy, and the only thing that spared me the further 40 to 60,000 pounds I might otherwise have thrown after the first 310. If there is a lesson in any of this, and I've had ample bitter leisure to search for one, it is not, whatever the tidy version of this story might want to conclude, that families in rural Thailand are somehow uniquely dangerous, because I don't believe that, and I think concluding it would simply be swapping one lazy assumption for another. What I concluded, slowly and expensively, is that moral satisfaction is not a due diligence process, and that a lifetime spent doing genuine good within a regulated system can leave you dangerously unprepared to recognize when the regulation itself, the surveys and inspections and institutional checks that made your career meaningful, simply isn't there to catch you anymore. I spent 36 years believing that housing families was an inherently noble act. It never occurred to me, walking that rice paddy for the first time feeling so pleased with myself, that nobility divorced from verification isn't virtue at all. It's just a story, and I was, for 2 comfortable years, only ever the audience for my own.